My friends and I used to do a lot of geocaching after our senior year in high school. For those who don't know what geocaching is, it's essentially a worldwide scavenger hunt. People will select sites and conceal a geocache somewhere unobtrusive, then post GPS coordinates on geocaching websites where other searchers can download the coords and locate the cache. Usually, people who have found the object will leave a note or a small personal object for future searchers to find and appreciate, mostly in a chest or something hollow. There are several types of geocaches, and most of them are thematic in nature. You know, scenic destinations, romantic sites, hard-to-reach areas, that kind of thing. My story begins when my friends and I decided to try a series of purportedly haunted locales within about an hour's drive of our hometown. It began innocently enough. Most of the sites had spooky backstories that were, of course, entirely fabricated. So we had a great time scaring the piss out of each other and generally creeping ourselves out. We'd begun searching after the sun had set to enhance the creep factor, but by around midnight, most of our large group had dwindled off and gone their separate ways. When we reached our last chord, there was just myself, Danny, Kevin, and Evan left, and we were determined to knock it off our list. Danny was our guide for the night, in charge of putting in the coordinates and reading us the backstory behind each site, so while I drove, he began reading about the last one out loud to the rest of us. Now I'm paraphrasing here, but it was something along the lines of Hinkle Asylum. Constructed in the early 1900s, the James Hinkle Asylum was built to house a burgeoning population of the criminally insane. People who had committed vile crimes, rape, murder, torture, without signs of remorse were deemed mentally unstable and sent to this facility for further study and rehabilitation. Once committed, very few criminals were ever released back into society, and those that were released usually had been given lobotomies, electroshock therapy, both of which rendered the patient nearly brain dead, capable of performing only rudimentary tasks. Contemporary visitors to the asylum report hearing banging noises, cell doors opening and closing, hearing cackling laughter that is abruptly cut short, and the occasional sighting of the creeper, a shadow figure that crawls on the ceiling behind some luckless visitor. It was pretty standard fare compared to the rest of the sites we'd visited that night, and we usually had a good time psyching each other out for the next 15 minutes while I drove us to the asylum. We'd all heard about it. It was in our local area after all, and we knew it had been condemned and abandoned since as long as any of us could remember. So we figured it'd be a great place to run around and be reckless teenagers without risk of getting yelled at by the cops. When we finally arrived, it looked like something straight out of one of those cheesy B-movies they show late at night. Chain-link fence with barbed wire around the perimeter, 2 guard towers flanking the main gate, which was, of course, chained and locked shut with a big no trespassing sign hanging from it. The asylum itself was decrepit, looking like it hadn't been touched for decades, which was surprising since we grew up in a pretty nice area where the lawmakers tried to keep everything looking spiffy for the tourists. Needless to say, we promptly ignored the sign on the front gate and hauled ourselves over, cameras and GPS in hand, and walked towards the asylum. Now, given our attitude towards the previous sites, you've probably gathered that I'm somewhat of a skeptic. I believe that there are paranormal things that can't be explained yet. But I'm not exactly summoning demons in front of a bathroom mirror. So when we opened the main door to the asylum, which was conveniently unlocked, I dismissed the cold burst of wind as just stale, pin-up air rushing out after being trapped inside for so long. My friend's bravado, however, quickly disappeared, and they began shuffling their feet nervously at the entrance, hesitant to cross that invisible threshold. I took point, shivving them along with prodding taunts, and eventually everyone was inside. It wasn't as bad as I thought it would be. Things were relatively clean, and the entire building looked like it had been gutted. The paint was peeling, tiles popping up here and there, and the metal trim near the baseboards of the wall was in desperate need of some rust begone. But aside from that, The place was entirely empty. No crazy-ass chairs with leather straps, no gurneys lying haphazardly around, just an old reception desk and 2 hallways leading off to the different wings. We explored for a few minutes, freaking ourselves out whenever we heard an old pipe rattle or rat squeak, but otherwise, it was relatively uneventful, our fears safely suppressed by the presence of each other. We began to get more adventurous, opening doors and peeking inside. The rooms were all empty, of course. Whatever company had been contracted to clear the place out did a pretty decent job of removing any creepy decor. Bravado returning by the minute, Evan and Kevin dropped back without Danny or me noticing. They began running around, making noises to try and scare us. And I'm not gonna lie, it worked. Until I realized they were gone, and probably the cause of all the racket. Then they returned laughing and breathless to a decidedly paler Danny. He seemed to be a lot more put off by the whole place than the rest of us, or at least he didn't hide it as well. He quietly suggested we leave. Not to be outdone by the guys in the group, I told him he was more than welcome to wait in the car if he wanted, but I was going to stick around for a few more minutes. Exasperated, but defeated, Danny finally caved and followed us where the GPS was leading, the 2nd floor. This is where I started to feel genuinely scared. Before I was just kind of creeped out, but there was something about the whole floor that literally gave me shivers, despite it being a warm summer night. We started opening doors like before, but we were a lot more somber about it. I guess I wasn't the only one who was feeling weird. Finally, about midway through the hall, we opened the door to a room, and there, lying in the middle of the floor, was an honest-to-God straitjacket. Every other room was devoid of objects, but there it was, a fucking straitjacket in the middle of the floor of some random-ass room in a condemned mental asylum. We all kind of looked at each other with raised eyebrows, as if to say, guys, you seeing what I'm seeing? And of course, trying to show off for Danny, I piped up with the most ridiculous idea I could think of at the time. Dude, I'm gonna put it on. Years of horror flicks and creepypastas should have trained me not to put on the creepy straitjacket in the creepy room in the creepy asylum. But teenage dumbfuckery won over, and once the words were out, I couldn't just wuss out. Nobody said anything. They just kind of looked at me expectantly, waiting to see if I'd follow through with my boast. Determined not to be called a pussy for the remainder of the night, I walked forward into the room and bent down to pick up the moth-ridden restraining device. As I got closer, though, I noticed it wasn't moth-ridden at all, but was actually in pretty decent condition. That is, compared to the rest of the place, which, as I've mentioned, was a shambles. I mean, it had a few stains here and there, but it didn't really smell, and it seemed intact enough to put on. As soon as I picked it up, though, I got this overwhelming sense of dread. You know, that drop in the pit of your stomach, right as you go over the lip of a roller coaster? That feeling in the bottom of your gut that says, I'm gonna die. I just know it. Yeah, well, I got that. Really strong, and totally ignored it. My desire not to die was outweighed, as it often is in teenagers, by my need to look cool for my friends. So I slipped my hands in the sleeves, one at a time, until it hung loosely from my shoulders. Now, if you've ever seen a straitjacket, you know that you can't tie it up yourself. The whole point is to essentially cross your arms across your chest and tie the sleeves behind your back to prevent whoever's inside from moving their arms, presumably to stop them from hurting themselves or others. So as I stood there in the middle of the room, I called out to Danny, "Hey babe, help me tie this thing off." He looked, if you'll excuse the pun, pale as a ghost, but he managed to squeak out, I don't think it's a good idea." But again, after some prodding and encouraging, I convinced him to begin tying the sleeves behind my back. Evan and Kevin just stood in the doorway, expressionless in a mix of admiration and shock. At that point in time, I felt like a badass for about 3 seconds. As soon as Danny finished up the last lace, the door to the cell slammed shut, right in Kevin and Evan's faces, I never felt a breeze, and when I asked them later, both of them denied closing it themselves. For sanity's sake, I still chalk it up to us leaving the front door open and changing air pressures and all of that, but it scared the piss out of me nonetheless. Then I felt a pressure on my chest, like someone was sitting on it, or as if someone was pulling the sleeves tighter behind me, and it began to get harder to breathe. I couldn't even summon enough air to whisper, much less call out for help. My vision narrowed to tiny specks, and I swear I heard someone laughing shrilly as I neared unconsciousness. The pressure increased with a sudden tug, and my world went black. When I woke up, my vision was foggy, or at least I thought it was, until I realized it wasn't just foggy. It was dark, like staring through a lens that's been collecting soot. I blinked a few times and the darkness wavered, but didn't dissipate. Now, I've passed out before, but whenever I woke up, it was nothing like that. Either my vision gradually cleared up, or it was blurry, but never in my life have I been able to recreate the shadowy haze I saw in the asylum that night. Then, from the murky depths, 2 small pinpoints of light appeared a few inches from my face, glaring a ghastly red, and a dim echo of the laughter I heard before surrounded me. As soon as they appeared, however, they were replaced by 2 brilliant shafts of incandescence, Evan and Kevin, shining flashlights down on my face. The last thing I remember hearing before I lost consciousness was Danny's yell and the door banging open, which probably explains why those 2 were standing over me with flashlights in hand. I gradually became aware of a dull murmur that I recognized as Danny asking me, "Please wake up. Please, please, please wake up," as he shook me. He just kept saying it over and over again, kept sobbing and shaking me. When my vision cleared enough, I glanced over and saw that his eyes were completely red, like he'd been crying for a while. Trying to muster some shred of dignity, I found myself speaking in a surprisingly calm voice, given how I was actually feeling. I remembered distinctly what I said word for word. "Get those fucking flashlights out of my face, you douchebags," expecting a laugh or at least some insults. I was kinda shocked when they just looked at each other, puzzled, seemingly surprised. You're okay?" Evan asked, amazed. "Yeah, why the hell wouldn't I be? Danny just tied the things too tight. I couldn't breathe, so I passed out." "How long was I out anyway?" Apparently, it had been long enough for them to untie the straitjacket, allowing me to rub a hand across my face. Another shared look of disbelief. "Girl," Kevin began slowly, "you've been out for like 15 minutes. We were about to call 911. We kept shaking you. Evan even tried pinching you. Hard. But you wouldn't wake up." I felt a cold chill run down my spine, and the straitjacket hanging limply from my shoulders suddenly began to feel a bit tighter. Hastening to pull it off, I tried not to look panicked as I threw it to the corner of the room. Danny just sat there, still shaking and crying a little bit, and in spite of the ordeal that I'd just gone through, I had enough sense to go over and try to comfort him. We left that room without a word, geocaching be damned, and walked back to the car in complete silence, broken only by the occasional sniffle from Danny. The sun started coming up, and as I dropped everyone off at their respective homes, we said quiet goodbyes. Danny was the last stop before I finally made the trip home myself. I walked with him to his door, and he paused at the entry and looked me in the eye. In the light of the gray dawn, I could see his eyes were still reddened from all the crying. He was very quiet, and he said, "I have to ask you something." "Yeah, sure. What is it?" I said, half expecting another, "Are you sure you're all right?" like I'd been getting the whole ride home. He surprised me by asking, "Do you know how long it took Evan and Kevin to get the door open?" His eyes held a look that I would never forget. It was raw fear. Something happened in that fraction of time between me blacking out and them getting in there that had absolutely terrified him. And seeing that look, I realized I was blacked out for 15 minutes. How long was he alone in that room? "No," I replied slowly. "How long?" 5 minutes. They said it took 5 minutes for them to open that stupid door. I was in there, and I saw you, and I saw..." He broke off, another sob stopping him mid-sentence. At that point, I didn't want to know. I still don't want to know. I gripped him by the shoulders and said firmly, "Danny, it doesn't matter. No matter what you saw, I'm here, you're here, we're both safe. It doesn't matter, nothing bad will happen, I promise." He just nodded numbly, opened the door, and walked inside the house. The next time I saw Danny, he was back to his usual self. But whenever I bring up that night to him, he freezes up, turns to stone, refusing to discuss it. I stand by what I said before. I don't know what happened in that room, and I don't ever want to know. But I still have nightmares about those two glowing red eyes in the darkness. And sometimes, as I'm drifting into sleep, I hear faint echoes of shrill laughter following me down into the depths of unconsciousness.